My husband introduced me to his business partner with a smile. Then he leaned closer and whispered in Spanish, "Tonight, she's yours." He never looked at my face after saying it. If he had, he would have seen the smallest pause, the almost invisible stillness that comes when someone hears the exact moment their life splits into a before and an after. The ballroom around us glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble, every surface reflecting wealth and celebration. A violin quartet floated through the room while waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne. Guests laughed over million-dollar deals, completely unaware that the man standing beside me had just traded his wife as casually as signing another contract. His business partner laughed under his breath. "¿Estás seguro?" he asked. My husband smiled without hesitation. "Confía en mí." Trust me. I understood every word, every single one. Years ago, before I ever met him, I had lived with my grandmother in Madrid while finishing a graduate program. Spanish had become my second language. My husband knew I had traveled abroad, but he had never cared enough to ask where. He assumed my polite smiles hid nothing more than perfect manners. He assumed wrong. I lifted my champagne glass before either man could notice the slight tremble in my fingers. From the outside, I looked exactly like the elegant wife everyone expected. Black silk dress, diamond earrings, practiced smile. Inside, something ancient and quiet settled over me. Not panic. Not heartbreak. Calculation. His partner finally turned toward me, extending his hand with a grin that suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you." His English was flawless now. "So nice to meet you," I replied, shaking his hand while meeting his eyes just long enough to let him wonder whether I had understood. Just wonder, nothing more. Across the room, my husband accepted congratulations from investors, laughing with the confidence of a man who believed every piece on the board belonged to him. He thought he had complete control. He thought I was another asset he could negotiate behind closed doors. He thought silence meant ignorance. So I smiled. Not because I forgave him, not because I was afraid, but because the most dangerous revenge never begins with shouting. It begins with perfect composure, and the decision to let everyone keep underestimating you for just a little while longer. My name is Elena, and for 12 years I built a life that looked flawless from the outside. People saw the tailored dresses, charity galas, and magazine photos beside my husband Daniel, and assumed I had married into a fairy tale. They never noticed how often I finished my own sentences in my head because he had already spoken over me. Daniel liked introducing me as the heart of the family, a compliment that quietly erased everything else I was. Before we married, I had earned a degree in finance, negotiated international contracts, and helped rescue my late father's struggling export business. Once Daniel's company began growing, he insisted it would look more elegant. If I stepped away from my career and focused on hosting clients, entertaining investors, and making every room feel welcoming, I agreed because I believed marriages were partnerships, not competitions. I thought sacrifices moved in both directions. Looking back, I realized mine were permanent, while his were always temporary promises. The irony was almost cruel. Although I no longer held an official title, I still noticed every balance sheet left open on his desk, every careless conversation overheard during dinners, every nervous glance exchanged between executives who assumed I was too busy arranging flowers to understand quarterly projections. People reveal remarkable truths when they believe a woman has stopped paying attention. Daniel mistook my quietness for dependence. His colleagues mistook my kindness for simplicity. Even his closest associates spoke freely in front of me, convinced I existed only as tasteful decoration beside a successful man. They never imagined I remembered details better than spreadsheets or that I could connect scattered conversations into a complete picture long before anyone else. By the time Daniel whispered those words in Spanish, he wasn't betraying a naive wife. He was betraying the only person in the room who had been silently keeping score all along. The whisper in Spanish hadn't appeared out of nowhere. It was only the first time Daniel had forgotten to hide what he thought of me. For months, I had noticed the small performances that unfolded. Whenever his colleagues were around, he would answer questions directed at me before I could speak, then squeeze my hand beneath the table as if the interruption were an affectionate habit instead of a calculated one. The room always chuckled politely, and I learned to return a gracious smile while memorizing every face that looked away too quickly. At dinner parties, he praised my taste in wine but dismissed my opinions on business with a light laugh. "Elena prefers people to numbers," he would say, though the company he proudly owned had survived its first financial crisis because of a strategy I had quietly drafted years earlier. No one challenged him. It was easier to believe the story he told than the woman sitting beside him. His business partner, Victor, watched those exchanges with growing confidence. At first, his compliments were respectful. Then they lingered a little too long. His eyes rested on me a second longer than courtesy required, his smile carrying the unmistakable certainty that no boundary would ever be defended if Daniel stood to benefit. What unsettled me most was Daniel's silence. He noticed every lingering glance, every unnecessary touch on my elbow, every comment wrapped in false charm. Instead of discomfort, I caught the faintest hint of satisfaction crossing his face, as though my presence had become another bargaining chip in negotiations. That was when I understood something far more dangerous than infidelity. My husband wasn't simply allowing disrespect. He was creating it, one quiet moment at a time, convinced I would never recognize the pattern until it was far too late. The turning point didn't arrive with a slap, a scream, or a dramatic exit from the ballroom. It arrived 10 minutes later, in the quiet hallway outside the private conference suites. I had stepped away under the excuse of refreshing my lipstick when I heard Daniel's voice again. The heavy wooden door hadn't closed completely, leaving a narrow strip of light across the marble floor. I stopped without making a sound. "We'll finalize the merger tomorrow," Daniel said calmly. "Tonight is simply a gesture of trust." A brief silence followed. Then Victor replied, "And if she refuses?" Daniel laughed, a short, dismissive laugh I had never heard directed at anyone but strangers. "She won't. She always does what's expected." The words settled over me with surprising clarity. Not because they hurt, because they explained everything. Every sacrifice I had mistaken for love, every compromise I had labeled maturity, every time I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was stronger than asking difficult questions. To Daniel, my loyalty had never been a choice. It was an entitlement. I walked away before either man opened the door. My heartbeat was steady. My breathing never changed. By the time I reached the ladies' lounge, my reflection looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Only my eyes were different. For years, I had spent my energy protecting our marriage from embarrassment. Standing there beneath the soft lights, I realized the marriage I had been protecting no longer existed. I wasn't deciding whether to leave him. I was deciding how. And more importantly, how to ensure that when the truth finally surfaced, Daniel would lose the one thing he valued above money, influence, and control: the illusion that he was always the smartest person in the room. Revenge, I discovered, is most effective when it looks like routine. I returned to the ballroom wearing the same composed smile Daniel expected from me. I thanked investors for attending, complimented the catering staff, and even stood beside my husband for photographs. No one looking at those pictures would guess that our marriage had already ended. The following Monday, I began preparing. Years before leaving my career, I had qualified as a financial analyst and spent nearly a decade negotiating commercial contracts. Skills like due diligence and risk assessment don't disappear because someone stops printing them on a business card. They simply wait for a reason to be used again. Daniel never locked his office at home because he believed I had lost interest in his work. I wasn't searching for revenge. I was verifying the truth. Quietly, I compared contracts, investor correspondence, and internal reports against copies stored in our shared cloud account. Patterns emerged with remarkable speed. Expenses had been disguised. Side agreements had never been disclosed to minority shareholders, and several signatures appeared on documents created after the supposed approval dates. I copied nothing illegally. Every file I reviewed belonged to accounts we jointly owned or records I was legally authorized to access as his spouse and former company director, I documented timelines, preserved metadata, and organized everything with the same discipline I had once used to rescue my father's business. By the end of the week, I wasn't holding scattered suspicions. I was holding evidence, and for the first time in years, I realized I didn't need to destroy Daniel myself. I only needed to place the truth exactly where it could no longer be ignored. I chose the annual board meeting because it was the one place. Daniel couldn't control the conversation. The conference room was quiet except for the soft hum of the projector and the turning of printed agendas. Investors, attorneys, auditors, and senior executives filled the polished oak table. Daniel stood at the front of the room, relaxed and confident, delivering another presentation about integrity, growth, and trust. I waited. Not for the perfect speech, for the perfect question. When the independent auditor asked for clarification about several transactions, Daniel answered smoothly, exactly as I expected. Before the discussion could move on, I spoke for the first time that morning. I believe there's another version of those documents. Every head turned. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, only quiet certainty. The room remained still as I handed a neatly organized folder to the board chair. Inside were dated correspondence, contract revisions, and a timeline that connected every inconsistency without a single dramatic note. I didn't tell anyone what to think. The evidence spoke with far greater discipline than emotion ever could. Daniel looked at me, waiting for the reassuring smile that had rescued him so many times before. It never came. His confidence faded almost, imperceptibly as directors exchanged silent glances, and legal counsel began asking questions he couldn't answer without contradicting his earlier statements. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel wasn't leading the room. He was chasing it. When the meeting adjourned, no one applauded. No one argued. People simply gathered their files and walked past him toward the investigators waiting outside. Daniel finally caught my arm in the empty hallway. "You understood." I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had worn the night he whispered in Spanish. "I understood everything," I said softly. "You just never thought I was listening." Then I walked away. This time, he was the one left standing in silence. News travels differently when it is carried by facts instead of gossip. Within days, the board placed Daniel on administrative leave while outside investigators reviewed the documents. Investors who had once competed for a seat at his table suddenly stopped returning his calls. People who had praised his confidence now described it as arrogance. It wasn't because opinions had changed overnight. It was because the truth had finally caught up with the image he had carefully constructed. Victor disappeared just as quietly. His messages went unanswered. His invitations were declined, and his name slowly vanished from conversations about future partnerships. Men who believe loyalty can be purchased often discover too late that fear is an unreliable business strategy. As for me, I never gave interviews or posted cryptic messages online. I signed the necessary legal papers, resumed consulting work, and accepted a position with a firm that valued my experience instead of my appearance. For the first time in years, introductions included my qualifications before my marital status. The greatest surprise wasn't watching Daniel lose his reputation. It was realizing how little satisfaction came from his downfall compared with the peace that followed my own freedom. People sometimes ask whether revenge is worth it. I don't think revenge built on anger ever is. But refusing to stay silent when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, that changes everything. Because the people who underestimate you are not always your greatest obstacle. Sometimes they become the authors of their own collapse. And if my story is worth remembering, I hope it is for this reason. Never confuse a quiet person with an unaware one. The calmest voice in the room is often the one that has been paying attention all along, and when truth finally speaks, it rarely needs to raise its volume. A year later, I realized the most important thing I had reclaimed wasn't my career or my independence. It was my own voice. For so long, I had measured my worth by how well I could preserve someone else's peace. I believed that being patient, forgiving, and understanding would eventually inspire the same qualities in return. Instead, my silence had become a language Daniel interpreted as permission. I no longer confuse endurance with strength. Strength is knowing when compassion has reached its limit. It is recognizing the moment respect can no longer survive without honesty. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is quietly close a door that someone else keeps leaving open for betrayal. Life became wonderfully ordinary after that. I rented a small apartment overlooking a river, where every morning began with sunlight instead of anxiety. I accepted consulting projects that challenged my mind, reconnected with old friends who remembered the ambitious woman I had once been, and even enrolled in a university program to mentor young women entering the finance world. Every conversation, every decision, every achievement belonged to me alone. As for Daniel, I stopped following the headlines long before they stopped writing about him. Whatever happened after our divorce became part of a chapter I no longer needed to reread. Some endings deserve closure, not curiosity. People often expect revenge stories to finish with triumph, applause, or dramatic justice. Mine ended with something quieter. Peace. Because the greatest revenge was never watching him lose everything. It was discovering that I no longer needed him to lose in order for me to finally win. The night my husband whispered, "Tonight, she's yours," he believed he was giving me away. He didn't realize he was giving me the final reason to take my life back. And sometimes, the most powerful sentence a woman will ever say isn't spoken in anger. It's the silent promise she makes to herself. No one will ever mistake my kindness for my weakness again.